Okay, well, good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us on Overflow. And we're so grateful to have you. As always, our hope and goal for Overflow is to walk through the sermon from the night before and to get the chance to process it and to talk about how we can practically engage with it as well as live it out in our daily living. And so today we have uh, Ryan Bogert here and myself, Ryan Clement, and we're holding down the fort today. And the sermon yesterday was on Isaiah 58, which is a passage that focuses on God calling out his people and saying, I see your spiritual practices, I see your devotedness, but you are neglecting to care for the poor and for the imprisoned and for the oppressed. And that's really what I desire from you. I don't just want empty spiritual practices, but I want you to truly love and care for others. And it makes no sense to be fasting while you are mistreating your employees, or to be fasting while you are also fighting, and to be fasting but to be neglecting the needy. And so, for me, it was kind of an intense passage. There's just a lot to call out there, but I think a very timely one, especially as, in these last few months, with the Black Lives Matter movement coming to more and more media sources, and just even more, I think, increased awareness of racial injustice in our country. Uh, this, I think, was just a pivotal passage for me to read kind of during this time and during this quarantine time where we're really processing our life and faith. And we're talking about reset and our whole series on resetting our faith. And so I think it's just important to say something I didn't get to say in the sermon yesterday. But the reason why this passage was chosen is because this series is based on really resetting our life and faith based on what we've experienced these last few months. And I think this topic is definitely been part of it. And so hopefully this is a part of our reset and reevaluation as we're looking at what type of life we want to live, what type of faith we want to live. I think this is a really important passage and topic to consider as we talk about those things. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to the sermon, definitely go back and check it out. And if you're with us live, we would love to hear from you. Let us know you're here. Type in the chat box. If you have any questions or comments, type those out as well. We always love to hear from you, and we'll go from there. So, Ryan, what were some of your initial thoughts from the sermon, and what stood out to you?
I think the thing that stood out to me the most in like the passage was how God called out the hypocrisy of the people, even though they were presenting themselves good and doing some things that many labels good, like they're saying, "Oh, we fasted and we humble ourselves before you, and we are looking for the things of God." But then God calls them out for where they're really at, where their hearts are really at. And I thought that was really powerful, and it was really done in a direct way that I don't know, you don't see it all the time in scripture where it's that direct, those two things put in direct contrast with each other. And I think for me, like, I think what everyone needs to think about in taking away, and I thought you modeled this well talking about yourself, but I think everyone needs to think about, like, is this me? And that should be like a scary question to ask yourself, or how am I failing in this way, or how might this be me, and how I'm failing, and where do I need to recognize that, and where do I need to grow, and where do I need to kick that hypocrisy out of my life, listen to what God is calling us to in this passage, and really dive into that and make real change. So yeah, that's what stood out to me most in the passage, because it was very powerful in doing that.
Yeah, I think there's a variety of responses that we can have when we hear a sermon like this. One response is, yeah, those Christians need to step up their game and to really think about other people more than we think about ourselves. Another response might be, I totally agree with this, and I think I'm doing this pretty well. Another response might be, oh, this was an Old Testament thing. This is Isaiah 2,700 years ago. This isn't for us today. Times are different, times are changed. Another response might be, okay, so maybe this is true, and maybe we do need to make some changes, but what do we even do? How do we begin to navigate how to break the yokes of oppression and abuse and
Mhm.
mistreatment, and so there's all sorts of philosophies and organizations centered around how do we care for the homeless? How do we care for the needy? How do we care for the hungry?
Mhm.
How do we care for the oppressed? What does it look like? In the Message version, it says to cancel debts. What does that look like? And is that something that we can do in our modern day society? And so there's a lot of good questions in there. And I'm hoping that the majority of us are hearing this passage and seeing themselves in the passage and really wrestling with how to live a more God honoring life when it comes to justice and
Mhm.
making the wrong things right.
Yeah, and one of the responses you just talked about, thinking, oh man, yeah, those Christians who really need to hear this, like you're thinking of like, oh, this other church, these other people who don't like do the right thing or aren't helping out or just, I think that is a very dangerous response. I think at least 99.9% of the time, if you hear a sermon and you think about how it impacts other people and doesn't impact you, then you're listening wrong because God has a word for each of us in these sermons. Um, you know, um, and I think that's how we need to listen to all sermons is how can this affect me? How can I apply this to my life? Because you can't apply it to someone else's life. You can't, I mean, maybe within your family or something, yeah, but you can't apply it to those other Christians who are doing something wrong. You need to listen for you and have an open heart to what God is telling you when you're listening to any sermon. And I think there's plenty of content in this for that. So I would say, if you listened and heard it for someone else, then maybe, I challenge you to have a listening posture for yourself and not for others, because I think that's because God speaks to all of us through teaching and sermons. So,
Yeah, for sure.
anyways.
And I think even though the majority of this passage is, or a lot of it is calling out God's people for what they're doing wrong. In the beginning there's this section that says, like, I see your devotion, you're seeking me daily, you hunger to know me, you're calling out for injustice
Mm-hmm.
and you want justice to be done. Um, and even just some of those characteristics, I'm thinking like, I'm not even living up to the bad example the Israelites are setting. It's like, you're daily seeking God, you're hungry to know me, you're drawing near to me, you're calling up for justice, yet you continue to mistreat others. And that's the big criticism. And I think about my own life and I'm like, am I really daily seeking after God? Am I really hungry to know his way and his will? Am I really trying to call out for justice? Am I really even living up to the poor example of the Israelites? And I think that's even convicting here. So yeah, I thought that was kind of an interesting thing, and that section even inspires me to like want to be regularly engaging with God, because I think we could hear this passage right, and we could say the Israelites did all the spiritual stuff, but they weren't treating people right, and a lot of people respond to that by saying, "Okay, I'm not going to do the spiritual stuff, but I am going to treat people right." And I
Mm-hmm.
think we see a lot of this course correction. There's a lot of people who aren't very regularly in church attendance, aren't really a part of like a life group, are might serve on occasion, just not very involved, but like they really try to be a good person.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is the same problem, just in the reverse. And ultimately, we need to be actively engaged in pursuing God together in community with
Mm-hmm.
consistency and regularity. And our integrity and character needs to be excellent in how we treat people. But I've seen too much of that flip response, I think, come.
Right. Yeah, and just to add on, as you were speaking, I was reminded of one of the passages you used, Luke 11:42, which it talks about the Pharisees giving a tenth of their mint, but of their herbs and tithing essentially, but neglecting justice and the love of God. And God doesn't say, well, the tithing doesn't matter, and you shouldn't, and but the justice and love is all that matters. He says you should have practiced the latter, the justice, without leaving the former undone either. Like those things go together. So like you said, it's a holistic call. It's not that only the things they were failing at matter, but it's that if you do one and not the other, then it's a broken example of faith and living as a follower of God, a Christ follower. And that's not how we're called to live, and we're called to more.
And I
So those
see
things
that
merge together.
Yeah, I've just seen that plague our culture in so many ways. I think marriage is one of them. And not that this is a sermon on marriage, so I won't spend too much time here, but um, we've seen the divorce rate go up and up and up throughout the years. And I've
Mm,
seen people getting married less and less, later and later, or being together in a relationship for a very long time before getting married. And
mhm,
what's interesting is there are more people living together in a relationship today who are unmarried than there have been in a lot of history when it comes to marriage.
right.
What's funny to me is basically a lot of people function like they're married. They just don't have the title and the commitment. And so, because a lot of people have seen divorces end very poorly and the destruction of divorce and marriages breaking up, rather than saying, I'm going to establish an excellent marriage relationship, they've responded by saying, I'm just not going to get married. But what's funny
Mhm,
is their relationship is pretty much everything a married couple does, just without that commitment, as if it's somehow easier to leave in that situation. And I think we that same thing applies to, I think, our culture. There's a lot of people who I'm sure are frustrated with Christianity, who are irritated with Christians, and don't want anything to do with that hypocrisy. They might even believe in God, or want to be a good person, or want to be a part of helping humanity, but just can't get past the politics of the local church and the web of stuff that kind of pollutes that, in their opinion.
mhm.
So I just think it's very interesting that there's a lot of people who'd rather just avoid being a Christian or being a part of the church altogether because it is so messy.
Mhm.
I know
Yep.
it's kind of a tangent, but yeah,
I have a couple of my best friends are in that situation where they consider themselves strong Christians, but have completely left the church due to hurt and due to other issues with the church. But so it's a challenging thing in our modern time for sure.
yeah. And it's almost like that's part of the reason why the God's people are getting called out in Isaiah 58. It's like this hypocrisy and brokenness that's kind of running rampant. Let's jump into considering all of the ways in this passage that God's people are getting called out. Um, are these valid critiques for today? Uh, and let's think about our personal lives, and let's also think about the church as well. So is this a word for today, Ryan, or is this like this is 2,700 years ago? These things are not relevant anymore.
Well, like I was talking about earlier, I think you always need to be listening for how this impacts you in your life here and now when it's talking about hypocrisy, when it's talking about, ways that these people were failing God. I always think there's ways these apply. Another part of your sermon where you talked about that I really liked is you talked about fasting, but there was one point where you kind of, and if I misrepresent anything you said, feel free to speak up. But there was one part where you talked about fasting not in just the traditional sense, but also as this like flip sense of fasting as something to give it to others. And I think you use the example of like electronic device you might not necessarily need, and you fast a bit and donate it to be generous towards others. And that was like, luxurious, like lavish clothing might be an example in the more ancient time, and that could work for today too, honestly. Like expensive clothing and but maybe I don't know. In that time, like feasting food while people starved, or potentially. But one thing I really um, that I think one really thing that hit me pretty hard in that is like fasting is like anti-excess, not living in excess, not living in overindulging in luxury and because I think in our American culture we're used to being pretty comfortable and we're used to like I see the thing I want and I go and I get it, um, to the point where we can spend a lot of money on pretty silly and frivolous things. And I'm not gonna like say like, oh man, if you have a TV that's more than a certain amount of money, you're doing it wrong and you're bad. But I think so because I don't think like it's a gray area. I don't think I can draw a specific line where this violates it and this doesn't. But I think then the call for us individually is like, where do we maybe are tempted to overindulge in our own lives and in our own walks and in our own like you know financial purchases, like because where our money goes shows a value. What we're investing our money in shows the values of our heart, which is one reason, and this is, I'm just tangenting a bit, one reason why tithing is so important, because if we're not willing to give some of what we've been blessed with financially back to God, then we're putting all these other things in our life as a financial priority above God. You know, and I just think that's important, because that show, where you invest your treasure, that's showing what you're valuing. So anyway, so in places of like excess, and I was thinking about in places of excess in my own life, where have I, you know, maybe put more money into something in a way that's silly, or between me and my wife as a family, there's the two of us, and where can we maybe find places where we can not overindulge and try to cut back, and maybe use that money in other good ways. Maybe use that extra money to help someone, or to increase our tithe a little bit. We tithe pretty consistently, the exact 10%, but maybe we could be giving more. Maybe we could be doing more, if we cut back on certain things that we're maybe overindulging in right now. So that was something I thought about. I didn't have any firm conclusions. Like, I didn't like identify this thing I'm cutting, and now I have $200 more, and that's going there. But I was just, because I actually listened to a sermon like about 30-40 minutes ago. But that was running through my head, and I was like convicted of that, and thinking about um, that challenge, because I really think that fasting is anti-excess, and being willing then to give that generosity to others is a very challenging call in this passage for everyone on a personal level. I didn't really talk about, that was a long answer. I've talked for a lot. I didn't really talk about the church much at all, because I just kind of was doing my own personal stuff. Do you want to talk about the church, or do you want to share your thoughts in response to what I said?
Yeah. I mean, I think I agree. And, we have to see ourselves in the sermon. And for me, I was talking with a group of friends recently, and about just different things that are not going so hot, I think, in society. And we were talking about people in prison, and we're talking about people wrongfully in prison in ridiculous sentences
Yep.
compared to their crime.
Mandatory minimums.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just if you look at the statistics of the justice system, and just some of the racial statistics, there's some pretty significant inconsistencies there. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done everywhere. But, we were talking about the prison system, we're talking about homeless, we're talking about minorities, we're talking about education system. And there's so much work to be done. And I think in my own life, I don't just want to sit in the comfort of where I'm at socially, economically,
Yep.
geographically, but I really want to reach those who need help, and want to do my best to work in these systems to try to see some progress and improvement wherever I can. Even if it's just making one homeless friend, on a bike ride. I've been thinking about that lately, and just checking in with them and seeing if they need anything, and seeing how I can help. And I might not be able to get them out of homelessness. They might not want to get out of homelessness. Um, but if I can just be there, be a friend, and be a support, and bless them where I can, I think that would be a step in the right direction, and I think about our church and what we do, and not just New Life, but the capital C church. And I think we need to spend more time and energy and resources on caring for the oppressed and the hurting and the down and out, and the lost than we do. And I feel like that's such a small percentage of what we do with church funds and time. Um, yeah, and so I think we're doing some good things. I mentioned in the sermon, having our food distribution is a huge blessing for so many. That's every week, I think, for something like almost 12 years or something like that. And we support these various shelters and housing organizations, and so we're really trying to do our part. As one local church, we can't solve everything, but the big question is, how do we take some steps in the right direction? And I think one of those steps is even just talking about stuff. And for so long, I've been trained that politics and religion have to be separate, that church and state has to be separate. And You don't want to talk about political agendas from the pulpit, and you want to stay away from being divisive. And I think there's some wisdom there. I grew up in a church that they would like tell you what to vote for and how to vote and who to vote for. And I never want to be that church ever.
Nope, we don't do that.
At the same time, we have to be in dialogue about the real issues that are going on. And I think we have to help Christians faithfully follow God by seeing freedom come to the oppressed. And what that looks like, I don't have all the answers, but I think we need to take some more steps in the direction of talking about these things, having conversation, and coming up with some creative ways of things that we can do to help people who are in need.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, there are a lot of directions I could go. I mean, um, yeah, I agree. I think there is more that we as a church can be doing. I think about a sermon that you gave a few weeks ago, and one of the examples you gave in that sermon, you talked about how the church historically, like there was like a big plague or pandemic or something that killed lots of people, and when people got it, they threw them out in the street and left them to die, and the Christians took them in and cared for them, right? And they were like the only social force at the time that was caring for these people who were actually sick. And I think about, that's such a dramatic like ministry and, putting oneself at great risk. Do we as a church do anything to put ourselves at much risk as, both as individuals in the church, organizationally? Not really. I mean, we do good ministries. Like I love New Life and I think we do great things, but we're not doing much to put ourselves at risk. And I'm not calling for like huge changes. We need to like shift our entire ministry system based off of this conversation, but but I do think there is more we can always be doing to help our local community. I think it would be cool, and maybe this is something we'll start doing more of soon, if we had our life groups serving in our local community more, and we had like doing service projects with like a local organization. What's the organization called that we brought the hygiene packets to? What's that one?
That's Margaret's house with Kingdom Causes.
Yeah. So organizations like that, they took our over 400 hygiene packets and they're distributing them to people who don't have anything, and that greatly serves their needs. And that's awesome. And I'd also love to see the next step of actually like partnering with them and serving with them directly, interacting with the people and saying like, hey, we made these hygiene kits at the church because we care about you, even though we don't know you, because we care about everyone, because that's what God has called us to do. We love you. Have this. I hope it blesses you, in Jesus's name. And we can impact people directly, and they know that it's coming from the local church, and seeing how we're making a difference. I think we're called to make a difference, just like that the early church did during those times. There was also a lot of thoughts I had in regards to the racial and political injustice issues that you talked about. Man, I don't know if I want to get into all because I could talk for another 10 minutes about that. But
Yeah.
what I will say is I do think it's important for us in our lives not to not keep our politics and faith separate. Those are things that should be interwoven, because our faith should impact everything that we do. As a church, I'm not a fan of endorsing political candidates as a church either, because I think both Republicans and Democrats and whatever other political party can be good Christians and love God. But, when it comes to issues of injustice, for example, I'll just touch on a few things briefly on this one, but you talked about statistics in the criminal justice system. For example, this statistic is a little old. I think the number's down a little bit. But, there was a point where Black people and white people use drugs at the exact same rate, illegal substances at the exact same rate. And Black people were 6 times more likely to be arrested. So thinking about that, it's like a white person is 600% more likely to get away with this crime than the Black people are. And we talk about Black Lives Matter and systemic racism and systemic injustice. And people are like, oh, there's just a bad cop here or there who makes a bad decision or is kind of racist. But it's like, no, this has nothing to do with any individual racism. I'm telling you, these two groups commit crimes at the same rate, and this one gets punished 6 times more. That's systemic racism built in the system. That's not about any one person or one racist. So there's brokenness in our system and how it treats people of color, period. So, and that's not on any one person. So anyway, so when it comes to issues like that, it's just, I think it's really important that we as Christians are educated and aware of things like that so we can see those issues. And I think statistics like that are why people are protesting, saying Black Lives Matter. And I think events like the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery only ignite. Oh, there's like a well-built fireplace ready to burn because of all that injustice in the system that I talked about and injustices they've seen in the past, and those events just ignite it. And I don't think we can ignore it. I really don't. Like, I think it would be wrong for us as Christians to ignore it. And we need to be educated and aware. And that's why I will plug for like the 8th time a documentary called The 13th on Netflix. If you haven't seen it and you want to get educated, go watch it. It is phenomenal. You will learn so much. It's just an academic look at the growth of racial relations in this country since the 1860s and the end of slavery. So it's phenomenal. You'll learn a lot. Go watch it. It's great.
That sounds good. Yeah, I think, when we ask the question, like, what can we do to help with depression? And if we don't have a lot of answers, it just reveals our ignorance to what's going on. And I'm speaking of myself as well,
Mm-hmm.
And I think a big significant step for everyone is to get educated, find out what's going on, find out um, where we can help and what needs to be changed. I think the second thing is we got to stop making excuses. When I read the Message version of Isaiah 58, there was a little piece there that says to stop blaming the victims. And I thought that was just a very powerful line because I think that's so much of what people do to dismiss oppression is they blame the victims. They say, oh, if the protesters weren't so crazy and rioting and looting, then maybe something would be done. Or, oh, I think these people deserved it where they lived or what they did or what they said. And,
Mm-hmm.
we see that when it comes to, rape culture, like we blame the woman for something she has done wrong, for what's happened to her. We see that in injustice racially. We just see that all over the place. And a
Mm-hmm.
good signifier of oppression is blaming the victim. And I think any conversations that try to dismiss oppression for whatever logical reason or for whatever evidence you want to bring to dismiss what's going on, I think that's the wrong direction. And I think we need to get educated. We need to get aware, become aware of what's going on, and then to see how we can help and how we can participate. Because conversations around making excuses, blaming the victims, and just trying to dismiss situations are never helpful. They're only defeating, and so I think that's a big part. And so I think for me, I think what I'd be super stoked to see is just our church and Christians in general having more conversations about oppression and injustice and about getting educated and about being aware, being in prayer more, and really wrestling with, okay, what can we do? Because there are organizations all over the place who are already doing something way better than we're doing it right now. And
Mm-hmm.
there's so many different groups that we can partner with, that we can show up with, that we can volunteer at, that we can help with, and become a part of the solution. And so, but I think just having an attitude and a mindset of wanting to get involved and wanting to find out what's going on and wanting to honor God by rescuing the oppressed, I think is really important. I just feel the conviction that I want the generations that come after us to look back on what we did and to say they were really faithful to God. They set the captives free.
Mm-hmm.
Rather than they were really faithful to God. They went to church every Sunday, or they read their Bible, or they prayed.
Mm-hmm.
And I think those are very important and necessary things. But I also want us to be remembered for people that were rescuers and rebuilders and redeemers.
Mm-hmm. I love everything you just said. Amen to all of it. It was great. Preach.
So, okay, that sounds good. Any final thoughts for our time for today before we wrap this up?
Um, I don't think so. I think I'm good.
All righty, sounds good. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the Overflow. We hope this time has been helpful, and we're praying for you as you're thinking through and wrestling through how do we live out the scripture in our daily life. So enjoy your week, and we will see you next week.
See everyone.